In 2530, mankind were continuing their expansion into the verse. The terraforming of planets was commonplace, and competition to be the first to lay claim to unformed worlds was fierce. A requirement to begin the terraforming of any planet was to have obtained permission from the UPE and complete scans to ensure that there were no signs of indigenous life. So fierce was competition that these rules quickly became guidelines. Gaia Planetary Services had no time for these guidelines. In their haste to beat their competitors, they began to terraform Pallas 3 without proper authorization from the UPE and without proper due diligence. The first of many GPS ships already landed, with more on their way. Sure enough, up on the ridge one came into view. But this was no transport ship. This was no human ship. It didn't even look like a Barnu ship. This was something far more sinister. Before they knew it, the 276-strong crew were surrounded. Ships were coming in from all sorts of directions. They didn't stand a chance. The crew were all took captive, but all was not lost. This bipedal reptiloid-like race gave a glimmer of hope, a small sign that maybe violence wasn't the only option. They released one man as a gesture of goodwill, Foreman Charles Baxter. Baxter returned to Earth and informed UPE senators of the chain of events that had unfolded. 15 days later, a way to communicate with this new race had been found, and they finally learned their name, the Xi'An. The crew were eventually released from Xi'An control, but unlike the first encounter with the Barnu, on this occasion there were no peace agreements in sight. Whilst immediate interstellar war had been avoided, relations were tense. In fact, relations were so precarious that for over 200 years, a Cold War would ensue. Just who or what had mankind gotten themselves mixed up with? The Xi'An Empire, located along the border of the Eastern Systems, is comprised of at least 14 systems. Whilst there is no formal figure confirmed, speculation suggests that a far greater amount of Xi'An territory lies deeper in space. Early Xi'An society lived in nomadic groups within the lush tropical world of Xi'An 3. In -244 standard Earth years, the Xi'An Civil War, known as the Great Divide, began and sparked the beginning of the end for this Xi'An homeland. Almost 300 years later, the war came to an end, when in an attempt to end peace talks, the weather satellites of Xi'An 3 were sabotaged. The talks did indeed end, as the damage done to the satellites collapsed the planet's entire atmosphere, killing millions of Xi'An. The loss of Xi'An 3 signified a major change for history. The calendar was reset to the imperial year, and for Xi'An leadership, a new Xi'An empire was formed. Survivors of the catastrophe were evacuated to Xi'An 4, which became the new capital for the empire. The Xi'An started to discover jump points and began terraforming worlds outside of Xi'An, and for almost 1,000 years, things continued to live in relative peace. That was until 1225. The reigning emperor's estate was eliminated by an orbital bombardment by the Kurthak, leaving nothing behind but a large crater. This was followed by the activation of dozens of strike forces around the Xi'An Empire, systematically targeting any location with ties to the emperor. Kurthak, a developed spacefaring civilization, had brutally ended the Xi'An's Second Imperial Age. Chaos unleashed across the Xi'An Empire. Those in the bureaucratic class tried to keep the government functioning. Traditionally, Xi'An had always ruled by a monarchy, the title passed down through the family line. Without an emperor and royal family dictating an overarching policy, divisions grew deeper, and the threat of another brutal civil war involving Kurthak was all but certain. The Third Imperial Age arguably changed the precarious path the Xi'An were following. In 1377, House Krei became the ruling family of the Xi'An Empire. The Third Imperial Age Wao Kray tested for the imperial markers shortly after being born, and proclaimed to be the new emperor not long after. Raised to be a ruler, she eventually ascended to the throne with a quiet confidence and immediately instituted a number of sweeping changes. She strengthened settlements and military fortifications. She banned jump point hunting between factions, and some believe this shift was what forced the Xi'an Empire to expand in a different direction, one that would result in them crossing paths with humanity. Our first glimpse into the Xi'an race gave an indication that they prefer subtlety and manipulation to overt conflict. In actual fact, whilst their history is rife with civil war and power struggles, there are no reports of the Xi'an being the aggressor in any external wars to date. Xi'an are masters of diplomacy, patient and refined. They live for centuries, and this heavily affects their way of life. In total contrast to the present-minded Banu, Xi'an act with thought for future decades. Even their crime is dignified. Since acting from emotion is seen as a sign of weakness and immaturity, organised criminality is managed by criminal houses, obtaining permissions from the government for their various activities, which includes robbery and racketeering. In return, criminal houses are only allowed to revoke a certain amount of money from the system. To humans, Xi'an culture can seem rigid and lifeless. The Xi'an present themselves as polite but neutral, particularly to those that they've never met before. That being said, Xi'an culture does have an us versus them mentality. They will not hesitate to take another Xi'an's side over an outsider, unless definitive evidence is presented to support the outsider's claim or accusation. They have never really cared for what they regard as the short-sighted and reckless actions of humanity, demonstrated well in our first encounter. However, the Xi'an do acknowledge humanity's ability and appetite for growth and destruction. This ability for mutual annihilation is probably what has kept either side from attempting an all-out attack thus far. Whilst relations with the Xi'an have warmed over the centuries, there are undoubtedly members of the Xi'an government who still regard the UAE with suspicion and distrust. What's not in doubt, however, is that the Xi'an have been ever present and influential in shaping humanity's time in the verse. During the Messer era, the Xi'an were often used as a threat and a means to terrify their UAE citizens and swell the power of the military. On the flip side, analysts have concluded that it was through this meeting of Akari and Kray in 2789 the revolution and subsequent overthrow of Imperator Messer XI was able to succeed. Today, this calculating alien race is at peace with humanity. Whilst there are still pockets of the Empire who look at humanity with caution, it is not unusual to see Xi'an within UAE space, usually falling into three categories: visiting Xi'an businessmen, younger Xi'an who haven't quite settled into the Xi'an culture, and expatriates. Human civilians are able to purchase export model Xi'an scout ships, supporting even more exchange of technology between the two. Most recently, trade has been boosted through the 2947 UAE trade agreement, designed to loosen restrictions and encourage more Xi'an to trade within the UAE. Similar to mankind, the Xi'an are too friendly with the Banu, and whilst somewhat neutral towards the Vandal, the feeling is most certainly not mutual.
Thank you very much for watching. In this series, we are covering the history of the alien races in Star Citizen and humanity's encounters with them. We've touched upon some historic events that happened in our history here. However, if you would like to know more about these events and more about our long and storied history inside the verse, then please consider checking out the Time Capsule series, where this is covered in much more detail. All the links to everything I talk about in this video will be linked in the video description. Thank you again, and I hope to see you in the verse.